Hello everyone, if you're new to my channel, consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful if you do that. Thanks. By the way, I also have another Naruto and Luffy fanfiction channel. If you are interested, link is in the description.
When the Tides Come In, by D.O. Warwahl. The Marines are losing a war that will change the world. As a last resort, they turn to the brilliant Vegapunk to solve their problems. So, obviously, he decides to summon the strongest man in the world. From an alternate universe, that is. They did not expect Monkey D. Luffy to fall through the wormhole. Pirate King Luffy meets Marine Luffy. Huge shout out to all the warlords of this channel. You know who you are. Want to stand among legends? Join the channel membership and show your support. Adios!
The last man fell. The war was over. Allies and foes watched as the match between the two greatest rivals of the age was decided. The winner, the man with the claim to One Piece. Dust and the echoes of one final scream settled. The crews of the two captains waited with bated breath, gazes shaking and bodies trembling in fear, their own opponents lying at their feet. The people still among the living stood in silence to see the dawn of the new era. Blood coated the rocks, staining them red and brown. Fire and smoke licked the edge of vision, and the smell of sulfur and death clogged noses. The Marines present let their fingers grow slack, and the clanging of weapons hitting the ground cut through the silence. They knew they had failed. Minutes passed before a silhouette of a man appeared at the summit. A gust of wind blew the debris clear of his face. Tears sprung to eyes, either in horror or in relief. Some dropped to their knees, shaking in fright. For others, wide grins replaced worried scowls. They did not dare speak yet. Bright red meshed with yellow and blue, black hair and hard eyes. A straw hat firmly placed upon his head. The man took a deep breath and declared, "I am the Pirate King." A cheer rose up from his supporters. 8 people charged up the slope and embraced the man, and in turn threw him up in the air again and again in their delight, effectively ruining the previously serious mood. That day was to be known as the Day of Rebirth, or the Day the Sky Fell, later revised as Sky Fall. It was the day the will of D was renewed, the void century uncovered and the grand line conquered. Raftel was claimed, and the Great War ended. That was also the day Monkey D. Luffy was named the second Pirate King. Blood pounded in his eardrums, threatening to burst with the slightest increase in pressure. His head was ringing, and the shouts that ripped through his torn throat silent to his own ears. One eye was swollen shut, still stinging but not the forefront of pain. He was enraged, ready to kill, to murder, and as his foe fell to his fists he hardly noticed skin being ripped apart, tattered flesh barely anchored to his bones. He felt old wounds split apart, sending white-hot pain pulsing across his back. His body was ready to implode, both mentally and physically. He was beyond his limits, well beyond his limits. It was fight or die. The final battle, the climax. If he didn't fight to the end, all he had done up until then would be for naught. Red splattered the ground like raindrops, the earth shook and the sky quaked. He was ready to die, they were all ready to die fighting for what they lived for, and even if they failed, it had all been worth it. Losing was not the same as failure. His heart stopped for a moment when they clashed again. Blood spraying and the pain intense enough to be felt by the people below. Bones broke, muscle tore, organs burst and rebuilt again and again, over and over. The eye of the storm, the final stand, blue tower fall, sky dragon roar, the beginning, the end of all things and the unstoppable will, and the truth. Shouting until blood coated his throat, all remaining energy and more poured into one final blow. Winding up and up and up, stretching and contorting before. He was jerked back into reality with a horrifying clear understanding of something so disturbing and so utterly earth-shattering, that he was left reeling. Gripping his chest, he desperately tried to suck in the ever-so-needed air. It felt like a lifetime ago he last breathed. While his body was temporarily lacking motor functions, his brain had gone into overdrive in a vain attempt to process the events just witnessed in his unconscious state. It was the most terrible thing he had seen in his life. He didn't even know things like that could happen. So why did he dream of such an awful thing? Unfortunately, no matter how hard his mind worked, he could not come to a conclusion. Luffy didn't even bother to try to comprehend the thoughts that ran through his head as he partook in that dream battle. It was too much to handle, so he forced it into the corner of his mind where anything he refused to think about lay dejectedly. It drifted from his present thoughts altogether, but he was still left with the terrifyingly crisp images and sensations that the dream had brought. When he had calmed down marginally, he heaved himself up into a sitting position and stared at his shaking hands. His fingers could hardly move, and when he looked at them he somewhat expected them to be coated in a layer of blood and dirt, and who knows what that other stuff had been. Carefully, and fearing the results, he slowly moved until he could check the rest of his body for the phantom signs of battle. There were no scars, his eyes were perfectly all right, his hair was still relatively clean and not crusted in dried blood and dirt, and there were no cuts, open, closed or otherwise. He once again looked down at his hands and arms. They had stretched. His arms had stretched like they were made of rubber. Giving an experimental tug at the corner of his mouth, he determined that no, he was not made of rubber. He pinned it as a distortion in the dream, as the subconscious sometimes twists reality. He swallowed thickly and ran a hand through his hair. Well, he was going to be haunted by that for the rest of his life. It was permanently burned into the back of his eyes. Shaking his head, he got off the bunk and stumbled into the bathroom he shared with 20 other people. In the dead of the night it was usually empty, but sometimes there was one or two stragglers getting a drink of water, taking a piss, or eating stolen food. He padded barefoot across the cold floor and approached the sinks. After splashing his face in freezing water a couple times, he looked up at the mirror to see a tired-looking boy just younger than him leaning against the back wall. It was his friend from the science division and not one of the generic douchebags he had to bunk with, which he was extremely grateful for. Though the boy could move like a ghost when he wanted to, Luffy could always tell when someone was near. Nobody could sneak up on Monkey D. Luffy, and that was a fact. Toma was observant and possessed great insight. He saw the spooked eyes and trembling limbs, and shot Luffy a concerned frown. "Something up?" the boy inquired with the same dryness of a burnt cookie. The brunette raised one of his slender eyebrows at him. Purple eyes still half-lidded from sleep deprivation. He probably just returned from his work, despite it being so early in the morning. "No," Luffy said unsurely, eyes widening further. It was widely known that he was a terrible liar, and Toma didn't even need his great powers of understanding or a good night's rest to spot the lie. "Damn it, Luffy, you know you can't lie, so don't try. I've never seen you like this before. Tell me what's going on." Toma was also very blunt. Luffy opened his mouth to speak, and then closed it again, looking down at the dirty floor. After cultivating a suitable answer from his tired and overused mind, he once again looked up at the boy. "I can't say." "Why not?" It seemed this had succeeded in getting Toma aggravated and further screwed Luffy over. Neither of them was very touchy-feely and the conversation was getting awkwardly tense very fast. The fact that Luffy was so shaken was a sign that something was seriously wrong, and Toma was very determined to pry the answer from the other man whether he liked it or not. "I don't know, it was. I've never seen anything like it, it wasn't like a dream at all." Luffy started to panic, flailing his arms around to try to get his point across. Though he looked like an idiot, similar to his normal daily behavior, it was his eyes and the way that he was still unsteady on his feet that gave him away. "You're not making any sense. There was so much blood." He choked out in a hoarse voice, and once again images and feelings flooded through him. He dropped to his hands and knees, forced to watch as once again he fought to a brutal death. Toma was instantly at his side, watching his reactions and trying to somehow get the shell-shocked man to calm down. "I was dying. Trying to kill that person. I don't even know who he is, damn it. It was fucking insane and so clear, like a memory. It was like the world was ending." He was crying. Luffy stopped in mid-sentence when he realized that hot, thick rivers of tears were streaming down his face and dripping onto the floor. Toma looked startled and pained to see his friend in such a pitiful state. The boy frowned before getting to his feet and hauling the still sobbing Luffy to his. "Come on. Let's get you something to eat. I'm sure you'll feel better with something in your stomach." That was the last they spoke of it for many months. Months later, shit, Garp swore under his breath as he slowly skimmed through the update he just received from Sengoku. According to the damned thrice piece of paper, Teach had advanced further into the New World and the casualties, pirates, marines and civilians, were piling up. On top of that, Whitebeard was flanking left and slowly approaching a key Marine base. And don't even get him started on the situation with the Revolutionary Army. It was as fucked up as it could get, and the Marys just happened to be on the losing end of the insane war. It was bad enough that there was some sort of temporary alliance between Whitebeard and Red Hair, but now it seemed that Big Mom had joined forces with Blackbeard of all people. Kaido was dead already, which led to an open position in the Yonkou that Teach had immediately assumed, for the moment at least. It was pretty obvious that he was on his way towards Raftel, the legendary island at the end only Roger, Garp's ex-rival, had reached some 29 years prior. Damn it all to hell, he thought bitterly and tossed the pages onto his temporary desk. He had been sent off on a bullshit mission to the outskirts of the Grand Line to investigate a painfully obviously false rumor. Apparently a local claimed to have spotted one of Whitebeard's commanders. Sengoku just wanted him away from headquarters for a while, he was sure. He and his grandson were their two greatest pains, and the admirals and the head of the science division, Vegapunk, had been sneaking around having secret meetings with Sengoku without letting him know. Something about that was fishy. Speaking of fishy, the stench of cooked fish wafted into his cabin and the door was tossed open to reveal his grandson. The boy, still mentally a child at 24, indeed had a hunk of fried fish in one hand, casually eating it without the aid of utensils. "Oi, Ji-chan, when are we going to get there?" Garp sighed and resisted the urge to slap his palm to his forehead. There was only so much of his grandson he could handle before he started to lose his hair. Already he was sure he was developing a bald spot on the back of his head. So much for decades of great hair. It was likely that there was a big red mark on the middle of his forehead anyway. "I've already said, about a week." "Oh no, not again," Garp mentally groaned and kicked himself in the shin. Luffy's lower lip jutted out in a pout, displaying an impressive example of the dreaded, puppy eyes. The boy's pleading expression was infamous throughout headquarters as something that could melt the hearts of the most solid and cold of men. It was deadly. Garp, unfortunately, was not immune. "I'm bored though," the younger man whined, making Garp somewhat wish that he had given up trying to drill into Luffy's head as a lad that he needed to be a Marine. He wished that he hadn't made the decision to take him along with him into the Grand Line to start training him from a young age. Garp silently berated himself for falling for Luffy's pout. "Go find something to do." "That's why I came to you, go somewhere else." It was going to be a long mission. "Hey, Toma," a young blonde woman said quietly, frowning at her dinner. It was bland and looked like a mix of green and gray goop. Overall very unappetizing. Unfortunately it was all the Marines could afford to supply to their personnel at the present time as all the funds were being directed to the war effort. She could hardly complain about the quality of food. "Yeah?" the boy replied, looking up from where he'd been poking at his own dinner. It was obvious that there was something on his mind, but then again, there was something on most people's minds. "What do you think Vice Admiral Garp is going to do when he finds out about the project?" she said. It was common knowledge among those privy to what the project entailed that Garp had been sent off to do a mundane scouting mission just to get him off everyone's backs for a while, especially nearing its completion. Toma thought for a moment, taking the time to seriously consider it. He prodded at the mass of goop with his spoon, stirring it together until it looked more like puke than food. It was good that he wasn't about to eat it in the first place. "I'm not sure, but it'll probably be pretty bad. I don't even think Luffy would be able to calm him down." The woman, Rika, shivered in fear and set down her own spoon. "That's a frightening thought." "I know what you mean." It was a fact that Luffy seemed to be the only person in headquarters that Garp had a serious soft spot for, even if the Vice Admiral still drove his grandson into the ground at the best of times. The man was a slave driver on his good days. Luffy was the only one able to soothe the veteran's fury when he was in one of his moods. "How do you think Luffy will react?" Rika asked with a faraway look. Toma laughed, throwing his head back in hysterics. "He'll probably beg whoever we pull through to train him." Rika smiled softly, temporarily sated. "He probably will," she said affectionately. Both she and Toma were involved in a top-secret, super hush-hush mission that could possibly turn the tides of the war. It was all Vegapunk's idea, and she was sure that there was some sort of ulterior motive, considering the amused glint in his eyes as he explained the theory, and the entire science division had been roped into it. Rika herself was actually a doctor, but because of how short they were on staff, she had been ordered to join as well. So far, only the admirals, Sengoku and those involved were aware of the truth behind the matter. They didn't want it to get out until after the fact so that less people would complain. They wanted a solider, a fighter, someone so powerful that no one in their world would be able to stand up to them. What they needed was the strongest man in the world. Unfortunately, the person who held that title in their world was currently on an opposing side. So when Vegapunk came prancing in shouting that he had found it, it was understandable that they were all confused. At first, they were unsure of what he was saying. Then he laid the groundwork for his theory, and then he proudly stated that he had already started the project and located a parallel world in which the strongest man was not a violent prick and would probably help them, emphasis on probably. On the other hand, it was impossible to contact them while they were in the other world, so they couldn't strike up a deal beforehand. They would have to do it the old-fashioned way, kidnap him, beg for mercy and then convince the man to help them. All three admirals and vice-admirals, excluding Garp, who had been sent on a mission because of the obvious protests he would give, had been called in for backup if necessary. Because, quite frankly, they were all a little worried that the strongest man wouldn't like their offer and open up a can of whoop-ass on them. They were all more than a little afraid, and it was for this reason that headquarters was monopolizing the Marines' strongest members. Don't worry about it. If we don't die, then Garp won't have anything to complain about. We'll have practically won already, Toma assured her, showing his own confidence and excitement. Yeah, she grinned in response. Are you absolutely sure that it'll pull through who we want? Sengoku was not in the mood for second guesses and less than 100%. Now that he knew it was possible, he wanted it to be true, the strongest man, fighting for them to ultimately win the war. Because, yes, at this point he was desperate and would sink to asking for help to end the insanity of a four-way war. Yes. In fact, I even know who it is. Vegapunk's mischievous grin was mocking him. Sengoku didn't fully trust the man, far too intelligent and liked to play around with them like a cat played with its food. Sure, he was an invaluable asset, but sometimes he was more trouble than he was worth. Why don't you enlighten me then? Sengoku sighed, massaging the bridge of his nose. I'm sorry, I really should not say, Vegapunk said in a sing-song voice, rocking back and forth on his heels. Well, figures. Vegapunk, just what the hell are you up to anyway? The elderly man chuckled, shaking his head. Sengoku couldn't see his eyes, and it made him nervous. They were hidden behind thick tinted orange goggles, so they looked a little buggy. It was like interacting with a statue sometimes, a very sassy and sarcastic statue. Trust me this time, you'll thank me for it. You'd better be right. Sengoku reluctantly gave up trying to get answers from the man. They would come out on their own eventually. Vegapunk had a knack for giving people the bare minimum, subtle clues so the person would piece together everything at the end. That was just his way. Well, we're all set, just waiting for your signal. Garp won't be back until the end of the month. Sengoku muttered to himself before nodding and fixing a determined scowl on his face. He would have if not for the stuffed seagull perched on his hat. Do it. Give biowave detectors maximum power. They're already at max, sir. Excellent. Can we track the signal? Yes, we're tracing? East blue, sir. Locking on. Vegapunk's mad grin stretched farther than his subordinates thought possible. Lights flickered and noises whizzed. A throbbing pressure emanated from a central point behind a thick panel of glass. The air was distorted and heat rolled off of it in waves. The scientists were all sweating profusely, some opting to take off their coats and roll up their sleeves. They did not have a need of professionalism at that moment. Rika watched with growing fascination. The chance to meet the world's strongest man was always a rarity, and the chance of meeting one from another world, one supposedly stronger than even Whitebeard himself, was practically zero. They were bending the laws of the universe, doing what was not supposed to be possible. It was the greatest scientific achievement to date. Twisting blue light joined the white noise and pulses of energy. The pressure increased until all the scientists in the room were having trouble remaining conscious. The sheer density of the energy pouring through was simply intense. One by one, they started dropping like flies. Only a handful was strong enough to be able to stay awake, even if they shook in fear. A cold feeling of dread gripped Rika's heart as she sat on standby, knowing that at this rate she would be patching up more than one person. It was the sole reason that she was sitting in a room full of scientists. She was there because they were pulling a living, breathing human being through a trans-dimensional portal. It was dangerous work. The 12 still conscious revved the machine like an engine, focusing on the central point in the other world. The machine hiccuped, and a blast of energy pushed against them, shattering the glass and sending loose objects flying every which way. It was lucky that no one was hit by stray debris, though it gave her quite a scare. A low droning filled the air, making Rika's ears ache. She had doubts. It seemed as though if the person they pulled through wouldn't kill them, the machine would. It was practically suicide. Just as she was about to voice her uncertainty, the head scientist beat her to it. "We need more." Vegapunk's shout was momentarily louder than the noise. Out of the corner of her eye she saw Toma dive for the panel at the side of the room. He flicked a handful of switches and replaced wires, and the light grew steadily more intense while the rest of the room dimmed. She covered her ears and crouched low next to a desk, trying to shield her eyes. An insane laugh drifted above it all, ringing in her ears and taunting her. One of the scientists had gone mad. The man tried to jump over his desk and towards the light, but was tackled to the ground by 2 others. With those 3 out of the picture, it was down to 9. Rika could only watch in horror as the energy continued to tug at her will, and she forced it away. Vegapunk dived for one of the computers. His fingers flew across the keyboard before red lights flashed across the room. He had hacked the grid. And then, in a moment of brilliance and awe, everything was bleached white in a magnificent display of power and destructive force. It was like a controlled explosion. Rika blacked out for a moment, and when she came to the room was in shambles. Everything was scattered, machines broken, people unconscious and groans of pain lifting up from the others. As far as she could tell, no one was dead. Just to make sure, she forced herself to get up. She drifted along the wreckage of that of a war zone, and found that thankfully, everyone was alive and had all their limbs attached. Vegapunk emerged in the fashion of a jack-in-the-box, bits of drywall stuck in his crazy hair and goggles askew. The man scanned the room with narrow eyes, making Rika uneasy. "What do you think he's looking for?" A voice startled her, and she looked down to see Toma lying on his back a few feet away from her. She helped him out from under the ruined desk, and noted that he wouldn't need first aid, but looked considerably worse for wear. "I don't know," she whispered back, her gaze flicking to the man who was tossing desks aside to check under them, ignoring his unconscious subordinates. Suddenly a barking laugh erupted from his throat, and Vegapunk vaulted over the broken furniture. He came to a stop at the side of the room, where a splash of red disrupted the monochromatic color scheme. It was the back of a shirt and thankfully not blood. The scientist dragged the man out of the wall and shook him into a semi-conscious state. Rika could only see his back and the straw hat on his head from where she was. She wondered if he was all right and needed first aid. "Wah!" He groaned groggily, and she could vaguely see him bring his hand up to his face to give his eyes a rub. Rika froze, blood running cold at the voice. She knew that voice, and the look on Toma's face said that he too knew exactly who it was. "The strongest man in the world, welcome to our world, Monkey D." Luffy, her initial shock refused to leave, and it clung to her like a cold in winter. As Vegapunk lowered the half-conscious man to the ground and let him take a look around, Rika and Toma shared a significant glance. In that one look they both confirmed that it was indeed Luffy that they pulled through, and not an induced hallucination from the energy through the portal. The same energy that made a man go insane. They could still hear the man's quiet giggling. "Have we messed up, or is this some sort of cosmological prank?" she thought while staring blankly at the violently red shirt Luffy was wearing. It looked oddly fitting on him, though Rika had never seen him wear that color before. In fact, everything he was wearing seemed to perfectly contradict everything he usually wore. Their Luffy, not this one, their Luffy, even though it looked oddly normal on the thin man. "Rika, get over here and make sure he hasn't broken anything," Vegapunk demanded, shaking her out of her stunned musings. Rika opened her mouth to protest, before realizing that she was the only conscious person in the room with medical experience. She was the doctor. "All right," she stuttered instead and made her way over to the 2 of them. Her leg was scraped by a rather sharp splinter that used to be a desk leg, but it didn't even register. Her mind was at a loss as to why it was her best friend sitting amongst the debris, staring up at her like she was a stranger. There was also the mind-boggling matter of him being the strongest fucking person in his own world. It was quite the conundrum. Fumbling with her first aid kit, she kneeled down next to him and searched for any cuts or bruises. He was pretty scuffed up, having been thrown through a wall and all, but was otherwise fine. He didn't even flinch when she used the alcohol to wipe clean his cuts. Their Luffy would normally whine and fuss, even if it didn't actually hurt that bad. It was alien and slightly disturbing. The front of his shirt was open, and she could clearly see a massive scar in the shape of an X. Rika tried not to look at the grisly shape, but her eyes were almost drawn to it. It looked like a burn scar, and a pretty nasty one at that. This is so bizarre, she thought, noting the way her stomach was churning. She knew that this wasn't Luffy, but at the same time it was, and they looked so similar. "Say, Vegapunk, where exactly am I?" Luffy spoke for the first time since the little noise he had given when abruptly woken up. The man was glancing around the room with mild confusion, obviously not recognizing it, though it seemed as though he recognized the eccentric inventor. If he recognized him, then maybe there was some hope. Maybe he really was Luffy after all. For a moment the elderly man frowned before a huge smirk swept across his face. Marineford. If Vegapunk expected a comical outburst from the kid, like Toma and Rika did, "How did I get here so quick?" or "Why is everything broken?" Then they were all surprised when his fists clenched, looking like he was ready to murder someone. "Why?" Luffy asked. "No," demanded. The tone sent shivers down Rika's spine, and she momentarily paused in her application of first aid to stare at how white his knuckles had become. Vegapunk's smile turned into a grimace. "Oh, I guess I haven't explained what's going on yet." Luffy pushed Rika's hand aside from where she had been bandaging a larger cut on his wrist before getting to his feet. She rose too, and Toma came over to stand beside her. He had been previously trying to rouse the others, but people more or less well off than him went to do the job instead. "You see, you are now what we call an alternate universe. Events. People. Even the world itself could be altered from yours." "Another world?" He looked shocked. "Yes. We can send you back soon, so there isn't a need to panic," Vegapunk said quickly, raising his hands in a placating gesture. The man continued to frown. "What about my Nakama? They'll be worried if I disappear." "I honestly didn't think about that." Rika and Toma both slapped their palms to their faces, sighing in dual exasperation. The man was a genius beyond his time, but sometimes he overlooked tiny details that had to do with the response and not the actual invention. Luffy opened his mouth, ready to let loose his anger at the scientist, but thankfully Rika had seen it coming and put her hand on his shoulder. "The lab is destroyed, so we can't do much about it right now, but he'll come up with something." She sent Vegapunk a glare, indicating that he was to leave. He took the hint, sliding away to his computer, which had recorded all the data from the portal. Rika and Toma stared at Luffy as he continued to examine the destroyed room. She was about to say something, but was interrupted. "So, Luffy, are you really the strongest person in your world?" Toma asked, grinning widely in excitement. He was obviously very impressed with the supposed title. Luffy's mood changed instantaneously, going from frustration to pride in a matter of moments. "Yeah," he declared, giving a she of happiness, hands on his hips and smile nearly blinding. "Even stronger than Whitebeard? Of course. I doubt that he'd be happy that you stole his title," Rika murmured nervously. "He's dead, so he can't get upset anyway." "Dead?" both Toma and Rika exclaimed in astonishment. Who killed him?" Toma asked, starting to shake. It was one thing to become the strongest man, but the other one had died first? What the bloody hell had happened in that world? Luffy spat the name out in disgust. "Blackbeard. Does Blackbeard cause you a lot of trouble?" Rika asked. "In their world, Teach was one of the 4 Yonkou and the one who pretty much started the war. They had their hands full with him, so he must be a pain for the people in this other Luffy's world too." "Not anymore." "What do you mean, not anymore?" "I beat the crap out of him. It was really hard to do though, because he stole Whitebeard's devil fruit." They shivered, even as the red-wearing Luffy laughed at some memory. Toma grabbed Rika and scooted away from him. Luffy just tilted his head to the side in confusion. "Damn it, I'd never really considered the possibility." Toma swore under his breath. "Rika, we have to be careful around him. This isn't the Luffy that we know. He's someone else, understand?" She nodded, already having come to that conclusion. It was just disconcerting when he had the face of her best friend. Rumble, nay, hey, you two, can I get some food? Although they are going to be similar, seeing Luffy eat was always fascinating. The way that he would impulsively stuff his face like a starving wild animal, or that whenever his grandfather was around he would eat extra fast and choke half the time, was a sight to behold. It was like he inhaled it, simply foregoing chewing and swallowing. During Luffy's mealtimes, everyone would move to other tables so that they wouldn't have their food stolen by wandering fingers. The kid was flexible and had a long reach. To other people, it was disgusting and resulted in a lack of appetite, so they gladly handed their food to him. This just filled more of his bottomless pit of a stomach. However, there was always a line to be drawn. This was just ridiculous. The amount of food he was shoveling down his gullet easily exceeded his normal, or their Luffy's, appetite. Spectators had given up on the idea of eating to simply watch in awe as he finished plate after plate without showing any sort of sign of slowing down. Bottomless pit indeed. Rika grimaced and pitted his nakama for the food bills they must have if this was normal. He was different. So different and yet at the same time exactly the same. He was still childish, laughing at the silliest things and acting so carefree. The laugh was the same too. But there was a certain edge in his eyes that made her feel like she was dealing with a wild animal. Certainly a very affectionate wild animal. Rub his belly and feed him and he was contents and fangs that could tear through them without any effort. Physically there were some obvious differences. This Luffy seemed more flexible and lithe, but definitely more muscled, considering that his chest was bare for the most part and they all could see the shape his muscles were in. She regretted nothing. He also didn't carry any weapons, and when Toma asked him what he fought with, he replied, "My fists, freestyle fighting, So that was rather strange. Another thing that she noticed is that when Vegapunk had mentioned something that he didn't really like hearing, he had gotten downright scary. She wouldn't have believed it otherwise, but he could and would get mean if he needed to. Their Luffy could be stern when pressed, but it felt more like an adult catching a child with his hand in the cookie jar, not a demon just waiting for the chance to attack. So similar, but so very different. Word was slowly spreading through headquarters of the mysterious project that the science division had been working on. People were starting to flood the room, packed into the edges like sardines to catch a glimpse at the strongest man in the world. They were just as shocked as Rika and Toma were when they found it was Luffy. She saw the doubtful glances and shaking heads. They couldn't believe it. However, they hadn't seen his scary side yet. It was all the proof she needed. Toma raised an eyebrow at her from across the table that the three of them were currently seated at. The two of them were sitting a few feet away from Luffy, trying to stay out of the splash zone. He noticed her glowering at the rather large crowd. "You okay?" he asked, ducking his head as a bone of some animal flew over his head. She nodded but said nothing in reply. "Hey, you, is there any more?" She was startled and looked to the side to see Luffy's abnormally large eyes staring right at her. Without blinking, she suppressed the urge to shudder and answered his question. "Why yeah," she stuttered and motioned towards the window into the kitchen. After about 30 seconds, yet more food was wheeled out so that the man could continue gorging. She cursed herself. Normally she wasn't this skittish. Another thing that bothered her was that this Luffy had absolutely no idea who they were. He didn't recognize Toma or Rika, his two best friends. It made her sad that he was so much stronger in his world but hadn't needed the two of them. Well, he did say that he had nakama, just not them. Frowning and looking back towards Toma, she noticed a burly man stalk towards their table. He had separated from the ring of bystanders around the room and was steadily advancing without resistance. "Is there something you need?" she drawled when he approached. Suddenly, she recognized the man. It was Garth, someone that their Luffy bunked with. He hated weakness and sometimes picked on Luffy just to get a rise out of the normally cheerful kid. It was also pretty obvious that he wasn't exactly the smartest of men, and a stereotypical musclehead. Luffy beat the crap out of him every once in a while, but Garth was as stubborn as a bull. He smirked, "Nah, I just wanted to talk to my friend here." It was obvious that the only reason Garth was here was because he'd heard the outrageous rumors and wanted to disprove them. He expected this Luffy was weaker because he wasn't wearing the Marine's uniform, which was absolute bullshit. If this Luffy was the strongest man, then she somewhat expected him to get angry or try and backtalk Garth. But Luffy ignored him. It wasn't the kind of, if I don't pay attention to him he'll leave me alone, sort of ignoring. It was that he genuinely either didn't care or didn't notice. He continued to stuff his face, not paying any attention to the now irritated Garth. "Oi, I'm talking to you." Garth got absolutely nothing out of the red-shirted man. Toma and Rika shared a confused glance. It was simply baffling. Garth was just as confused and stood there with his mouth half open and eyebrows upturned. When he didn't gather the reaction that he wanted, slammed his fists down on the table and shouted at the much smaller man. Again, there was no reaction, just face stuffing. By this time the entire room was focused on the little scene in the center of the room. They had also realized that this wouldn't have been their Luffy's reaction, and was eager to see what this newcomer would do. Garth had enough of being in the background, and did the most natural thing. He grabbed the piece of food that was currently in Luffy's hands and tossed it over his shoulder. "Yeah, that got the guy's attention all right. Bastard. I was gonna eat that," Luffy growled, glaring at the man. Garth took this as an act of weakness and laughed, throwing his head back. Now that he had the strongest man's undivided attention, he was reveling in the chance to try and drive him into the ground. "Sorry, I just needed to talk to you, and since you were so distracted, I needed to grab your focus." Luffy frowned in return. "Then what do you want?" Garth was taken aback and needed a moment to organize his thoughts. Well, I don't know what you're trying to pull, but if you think we're going to believe this bullshit, then you're going to be in a world of hurt." He smiled in mockery and confidence, believing that he had done a good job at being intimidating. Behind him, some people looked uncertain, while some rolled their eyes or outright glared at the people from the science division. Rika could practically see what Toma was thinking at that moment. The crowd was displeased and refused to believe the possibility that maybe this was a different, stronger Luffy from another world and not their Luffy, who would have punched Garth in the face already. It seemed that the Luffys shared an honor of mealtime. She watched as Luffy lowered his chin, but not in a submissive gesture. The way that his hat, the one he refused to take off since the get-go, shadowed his eyes so one was out of view caused the air around them to grow thicker. The menacing aura combined with the intimidating appearance of the shadowed eyes made Rika's gut clench in fear and her breath catch in her throat. "You want to fight?" he asked in a lower, deadly calm voice. Garth, poor, ignorant Garth, pressed on. He laughed right in Luffy's face. "You mean with you? That would be a waste of my time?" Instead of getting angry, like they expected once again, Luffy shrugged and continued eating. Garth's attempts at goading him on failed completely. Enraged, Garth threw his fist at the other's face, intending to knock at least a few teeth out. And then, something miraculous happened, stunning everyone in the room into a vegetative state. Like he knew exactly where it was going to hit, and without pausing in his eating, Luffy grabbed Garth's fist with one hand, effectively and completely stopping it. Garth growled and tried to release his hand, but the grip was like iron. With an effortless flick of his wrist, Luffy sent Garth flying over his shoulder and into the other wall. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, staring with jaws on the floor at the Garth-sized hole in the wall. The unconscious man was embedded deeply in the brick. In that moment they knew, without a doubt, that his man was not to be messed with. He wasn't their Luffy. He was the strongest man in the world. Footsteps echoed through the eerily silent room, not including the sounds of scarfing. The doors were flung open and the silhouette of Sengoku himself filled the doorway. The seagull hat was the giveaway. He took one glance at the hole in the wall and still eating Luffy, and effectively summed up the situation in his head. "Monkey D. Luffy," he called. The man paused to look up at Sengoku. Whether it was in fear or respect, Rika couldn't tell, but after that display of raw power she assumed it was the latter. "I need to speak to you." The Vice Admirals, -1 Monkey D. Garp, were whispering among themselves. In the war room they sat with tense shoulders and spoke in hushed voices. Littered around the room, filling it with a dull droning only this sort of activity could create. The strongest man in the world, or his world, was at headquarters, and rumored to be stronger than Whitebeard himself. Immediately after the explosion that occurred in the science lab, panic and discord had rippled through headquarters. All of the admirals and vice admirals had been assembled for an emergency meeting, and shortly after Vegapunk had entered to explain the situation. Monkey D. Luffy was the name of the strongest man. It left them all speechless. They had no idea what to make of it. Kizaru and Aokiji waited patiently for Sengoku and Luffy to arrive. They sat on either side of the fleet admiral's chair, watching the door like birds of prey. They arrived without a special entrance and with a lack of gusto. The vice admirals didn't even realize that Sengoku had arrived until the man cleared his throat rather loudly. They immediately quieted down and watched as he proceeded to his own seat across the room. In the doorway, looking just as boyish as they expected, was Monkey D. Luffy. "Get out of the way, kid," a gruff voice rumbled, and the person belonging to the voice shoved Luffy aside to enter the room. It was Admiral Akainu, who hadn't gotten the memo and did not know that he pushed aside the reason the meeting had been called. They all watched in mild horror as Luffy's fists clenched and he gritted his teeth in half-suppressed rage. For what reason, they couldn't fathom. Pure hatred rolled off of him in waves. Only when Akainu had taken his seat that Luffy looked right at Sengoku. "Make him leave," he snarled, motioning towards a somewhat confused Akainu. The man didn't understand why the kid was calling the shots. "I'm afraid I can't do that. Admiral Akainu is a key part of our military and has just as much right to be here as anyone else." Sengoku tried to reason with the kid, but it didn't seem to be working. Though his voice was patient, it was also very strained and tired. "I don't care. Get rid of him or I will." The threat was left hanging in the air. "Ha ha ha. Is this kid for real? Who the hell is he?" Akainu's barking laugh filled the room, accompanied by the sound of him slapping his knee. "He's the reason we're here. This is the person Vegapunk got," Sengoku stated as though it was the most obvious thing in the world. That effectively shut Akainu up, and the older man eyed Luffy with some distrust. He didn't laugh again. "Luffy, I don't know what you have against him, and I don't really care. If he stays quiet, will you let him stay?" Sengoku was being rather lenient, everyone thought. He obviously trusted Vegapunk, despite the pain that the scientist sometimes was. Luffy looked like he was going to throw something, but instead frowned and nodded once. "Take a seat then." Cautiously, and shooting Akainu a distrusting glare, he sat down at the empty chair closest to the door. Everyone's eyes were focused solely upon him, but he did not fidget under their gaze. After a moment of tense silence, Luffy's impatience got the better of him. "So, what did you want then?" Sengoku paused for dramatic effect, before sighing, "I hate to admit it, but we need help. I don't know if Vegapunk told you yet, but we brought you into this world to ask for your assistance." Luffy blinked owlishly at them for a few moments. They could practically see the gears turning in his head as he processed what they were asking. "My help?" He said it to himself more than anything, just to confirm that they were serious. Sengoku nodded in response to the rhetorical question. Luffy then laughed. Not a chuckle or his trademark, shi, but a full-blown howl of laughter. They were quite taken aback. There they were, having poured in countless bellies into the project, hours upon hours of labor, taken the time to send Garp on a faux mission and had stooped so low as to ask for a single person's help. Albeit in their world he was a soldier in their army. And he laughed at them. It was pretty insulting. Akainu and a few of the vice admirals looked ready to object, a few rising to their feet in rage. Sengoku put up his hand as a call for order, and as the laughter died down they reluctantly took their seats. Luffy then looked straight at Sengoku, a mischievous grin on his face. "What's in it for me?" he asked. They were all confused, but thankfully Sengoku took it all in great stride. Vegapunk himself had said that there was a chance that he wouldn't help them. He was prepared for this. "What would you want in payment?" "Meat," he declared immediately, causing a bead of sweat to form on everyone's temple. Luffy then paused to actually consider the proposition, and lots of money. "Nami'll kill me if I don't bring at least that much back." Sengoku was unsure how much "lots" entailed, but pushed it to the back of his mind. "Very well." "What? You can't actually be serious," Akainu objected, breaking his implied order to remain silent. He slammed his fist against the table and glared at his superior. "Hold on a minute, why don't we give the kid a chance first?" Vegapunk assured us that he was the real deal, after all. Surprisingly, it was Kizaru who had spoken, getting to the point before Sengoku. The fleet admiral nodded his head and looked over at Aokiji. Aokiji always had great ideas, so it was no surprise to him when they all fixated on him, searching for the logical answer to their problem. Even Akainu had halted in his protest to listen to him. How about we have him take care of one of the former Shichibukai? The Shichibukai were widely known as one of the three great powers on the Grand Line, a sort of in-between. Not really on the Marines' side, but not really pirates, at least, not anymore. However, when the war started, the Marines had demanded that they chose a side and go with it. Unfortunately, most of them had chosen piracy. Some claimed to be simply watching the war unfold, but the Marines, being suspicious of all pirates, never really believed them. If Luffy indeed was the strongest man, then defeating one of the Shichibukai wouldn't be a problem. If he was a fake, he would be pulverized. The tension started to dissipate, and everyone calmed down. How about we have him take care of that traitor Jinbei? Someone suggested. There were nods of heads, and they looked towards the boy for his answer. He was frowning. I won't fight Jinbei for you. Why not? I won't fight Jinbei. How about Crocodile? He's been a real pain in our ass since that whole Alabasta fiasco, another vice admiral suggested. Like the first time, they looked for Luffy's answer. Alabasta? He asked instead. Did something happen there? In the middle of their civil war, Crocodile caused a massive explosion in the capital city. Among the dead were the royal family and the pirate Nico Robin, but most of the deceased were innocent citizens. Luffy's eyes took on a murderous glint, and a shiver of apprehension and an instinctual fear for one's life passed through all people in the room. Even the admirals and fleet admiral found themselves wishing that they wouldn't have to fight the small man. I'll take care of Crocodile. Sengoku was startled. Strange thoughts swirled in his mind and threatened to overwhelm him. Who was this man, who had just made every vice admiral in the room wet themselves out of fear? The boy was hardly an adult, smaller than most people in the room, and half the time he just grinned stupidly. Sengoku frowned. How perplexing. A fitting word indeed, as he felt a shudder pass down his own spine. The child wasn't even emitting haki, and he could still feel the strength of his will from across the room. He hadn't felt such a thing since the time Roger ran rampant across the world. Perhaps Monkey D. Luffy, the child that he often found hiding under his desk with stolen food or hiding from his grandfather, was capable of things they wouldn't even be able to comprehend. Maybe, just maybe, he was the strongest man in the world. He was intrigued. I'll take care of Crocodile. 5 words and everyone could feel the approaching doom. Emotions and half-forgotten sensations from nightmares when they were children resurfaced, and while they were strong enough to not cry out for their mothers, they were left wishing for the same comfort. Sengoku watched as a few of his men gripped the edge of the table or their knees until their knuckles turned white. A few broke out into a cold sweat. There was a satisfied, cold glint in the man's black eyes before he smirked. Some were able to breathe once more, and Sengoku could feel his legs again. All gazes were fixed firmly on the kid sitting in a deceptively innocent manner in the chair closest to the door, straight across from Sengoku. He had his arms crossed over his chest, partially hiding his large scar from view. His shoulders were slumped and relaxed. His back leaned against the chair. Luffy and Sengoku didn't break eye contact through the entire event, and when the boy broke out into a mocking, self-satisfied, cat-like grin, the fleet admiral narrowed his eyes. It was as if he knew something Sengoku didn't, and liked to keep that something tickling the edges of his senses, driving him mad with curiosity. He gave one curt nod, signaling that he was fine with the arrangement. If Luffy wanted to fight Crocodile, then he was welcome to. The former Shichibukai, as one of his vice admirals had said, had been a rather large problem for them recently. He had defected, caused the deaths of nearly an entire country, wiped out a royal family and murdered a woman they'd been after since her debut at the burning of Ohara. It was embarrassing. Crocodile wasn't one to be messed with. He had a painfully useful logia-type devil fruit, was incredibly cunning and absolutely ruthless. A bad combination. However, after that display of power, Sengoku had little doubt that the scruffy young man sitting across from him could handle the sand croc without breathing heavily. It was getting over that fact that would take some time and getting used to. Luffy rose to his feet. "Find me when you're ready to take me to him," he simply stated while adjusting the straw hat on his head. The boy then turned to leave, walking right out of the war room like it was the most natural thing to do. Like there weren't the Marines' top officials watching his every move. His arrogance was another thing that needed to be minded. The door clicked back into place, and the room felt marginally warmer. The strung-up Marines collapsed in their seats, one or two fighting back tears. Sengoku's frown grew deeper as he exchanged glances with his admirals. A stray thought caught his attention. When Luffy heard of Alabasta's fate, he was wearing the same expression he wore when facing down Admiral Akainu. They found him wandering the halls like a lost puppy. Toma was the first to spot him. Luffy strolled down the hallway, glancing over his shoulder every so often and arms comfortably placed behind his head. He looked both relaxed and nervous. He refused to look out the windows, which Rika thought odd because the view was fantastic. "Oi, Luffy," Toma called, causing the one addressed to pause in his wandering. He looked over at the two of them, and a smile broke out across his unusually somber face. She and Toma trotted up to him. "What did Fleet Admiral Sengoku want with you?" Rika blurted out. It had been nagging her since the man had barged in earlier in the day. They hardly ever saw him even close to the mess hall, so it was surprising in the act itself, never mind the reason for the visit. Luffy chuckled, eyes twinkling with amusement. "He wants my help, but first wants proof that I'm strong." "Proof?" Toma asked. "I'm going to go beat the crap out of Crocodile for them?" Rika felt her stomach drop. Sure, this Luffy was scary and could easily toss a 200-pound man over his shoulder. But Crocodile was a former Shichibukai. He's the strongest man in the world, she reminded herself. On another note, Luffy not only looked at ease with the decision, but as though he was looking forward to it. "He's got a pretty nasty ability, so be careful at least," Toma said in warning. "I know. I've fought him before." "You have?" Rika asked. Luffy nodded, but he frowned sullenly, as though it brought heavy memories. "You can feel it, can't you?" Vice Admiral Stainless murmured, sipping at an alcoholic drink only serving to calm his frayed nerves. They were all a little uneasy as of late. His fellow in arms said nothing in reply, eyes trained on the people running about below. His usually dopey eyes were sharp and attentive. The two of them watched in silence as they watched their subordinates. The Luffy kid had arranged a sort of impromptu soccer game on the main deck to pass the time. Many of the lower-ranking officers and a few of the older ones had joined in until both teams had a decent amount of players. Luffy was dominating the field, using his now apparent speed to easily dart between people. The vice admirals on the deck above could tell that he was going easy on the other players and had little doubt that he could move much faster. "There's something I don't like about that kid," Yamakaji said. "It's like..." "I know." They had no need to explain the cold feeling settled in their guts. The nervousness they both felt since the boy had walked into their meeting that day a week prior. An instinctual wariness towards the monster currently laughing his head off as he passed the ball to someone else. Currently they were on a warship wading through the Grand Line towards Alabasta. Crocodile had a thing for sand, being made of the stuff, and fought the best on his home turf, so the ex-Shichibukai was reluctant to leave the ruined country. The last inhabitants of the island remained, crushed, defeated, but still loyal to the late sovereigns. The Marines hadn't been prepared to move in, having to deal with a large-scale war blossoming on the horizon, so they let Croc have the desolate country, even if it was never admitted out loud. "Do you think he has ties with their royal family?" "Probably, considering his reaction to the news of their deaths," Stainless concluded. Luffy's reaction had been a little strange, but they only noticed in hindsight. At the time they had been too afraid to think clearly. But, he also looked pretty angry at Admiral Akainu. "For a moment I thought he was going to attack him," Yamakaji admitted, a shiver traveling up and down his spine. He took a cigar out of his pocket and lit it. There's obviously bad blood between them. The stones were already worn down by sand, the blurred letters hardly legible in the setting sun. The sand was stained orange in the dying light. Monkey D. Luffy sat down before the stones, his head bowed and mouth silent. The boy had taken his hat off as a sign of respect. The crew that had traveled with him to Alabasta's capital watched on as the boy mourned the royal family of their world. Tears swam on the edges of some of their eyes as they took in the sad sight before them. Two gravestones were erected in front of the crater that used to be Alubarna, each representing the two members of the royal family. Nefertari Cobra and Nefertari Vivia, field of wooden memorials to honor the rest of the dead. There were no remains, only empty graves. The explosion had erased everything. After many minutes of solemn silence, Luffy slowly rose to his feet and replaced the hat onto the crown of his head. When he turned around, his face was like stone. The man simply stalked past the rest of them, shoving people aside when needed. They watched, speechless as Luffy steadily made his way towards the two vice admirals at the back of the crowd. He stopped in front of them to make his demands. "We're going to Rainbase." "Rainbase?" Stainless said with a frown. "Ah, that's where Crocodile will be," Luffy said with certainty. Their arrival at Rainbase was a quiet one, but not unnoticed. There were people there, scraggly, skinny and sick-looking people whose eyes showed their lack of hope, and the way they waked seemed like to shuffle to the execution stand. Soon enough they recognized the group as the Marines. Light flashed in dull eyes and they instinctively flocked to the promise of safety. A crowd of followers accumulated behind them as they trekked through the city towards its heart. Stainless and Yamakaji exchanged glances, but wordlessly followed their self-declared leader. Luffy strode through the city as though he knew his way around. His face was shadowed by his hat, but the unfortunate Marines didn't need to look at his face to read his mood. He was radiating the intent to kill. When they arrived at the casino in the middle of the city, Crocodile was waiting for them. His own little personal army consisted of at least 10 Bananawanis. "Holy shit," said a Marine officer before he soiled himself. "The Baroque Works agents and many, many footmen." The small group of Marines were instantly surrounded. The vice admirals let their hands rest on the hilt of their swords or guns, eyes darting back and forth at the crowd. People were about to get hurt. The agents and their partners watched the group of Marines with hungry, blood-lusted eyes. They stretched muscles, cracked knuckles or readied weapons. The Bananawanis licked their lips and eyed the tiny men, anticipating their next meals. And then there stood Crocodile on top of the bridge, crossing his personal lake in all his slicked back hair, face scar, cigar smoking, huge coat glory, grinning down at them smugly. "Oi, Mustache-o-san," Luffy spoke for the first time since they left Alubarna. Stainless, who had given up trying to correct the boy on the use of the annoying nickname, turned his head to stare at the boy's back. "You wanted him alive, right?" "Yes," Stainless said, eyebrows drawing together. "Why would he?" A burst of incredibly intense haki erupted from the small man's body, and their eyes immediately rolled back into their heads as each and every one of them fainted. "What's wrong with not wanting anyone to die? People die." He received a stinging slap. Luffy walked forward towards the dumbfounded Crocodile. He could tell that the former Shichibukai had wanted to unleash his self-centered egotistical speech about how there was no chance in hell that they would survive and that it was a waste of time to come all the way out there. The Pirate King had already heard that drivel and wasn't inclined to listen to it again. "Stop talking like that. I'm not going to let you say that again. That's exactly what we're trying to prevent. Not the rebel army, not the royal army. No one in this country is at fault. So why does anyone have to die? It's all Crocodile's fault." He punched her in the face. "Then why are you risking your life?" In this world, he wasn't there for her. She probably did all she could to stop the rebellion, and because she had no one to rely on, she died. Luffy cracked his knuckles as he ascended the stairs to the bridge across the moat, heading right for Crocodile. He had purposely left Crocodile conscious so that he would be awake when Luffy beat the shit out of him. In his own world, Crocodile was no longer a threat. He stayed out of the king's way and avoided Alabasta like the plague. He knew that if he went anywhere near Vivi or her country, Luffy would kill him. From looking at this country, what needs to be done most? She started to punch and slap him, taking out her frustration on the boy she was sitting on. "What of it? Is even clear to me. You think risking your one life will be enough? Then what am I supposed to risk? What am I?" He grabbed her arms to stop her abuse of him. "I have nothing else left to risk, nothing." It enraged him. He threw her off. "Try risking our lives along with yours. We're your nakama." She cried. Not here. She had no nakama to rely on here. She was dead. Robin too. The Luffy in this world wasn't a pirate, so he hadn't gotten involved with Alabasta's civil war. Vivi died, and he hadn't met Robin either. It made him sick to think that his archaeologist would have been snuffed out like a candle, no one caring about her death and simply fading from the world as though she was worth nothing. Luffy would be sure to hug her when he got back, and then go visit Vivi and hug her too. "I want to live." Words and memories crowded his mind as he rushed forward and punched Crocodile in the gut before the slimy man could even process what was going on. Luffy hadn't even needed to use Basashoku Haki to send him flying into his casino. Luffy launched himself in after his prey. Crocodile was still on the floor as he swooped in to deliver a rather nasty blow to the jaw. As he expected, Crocodile had recovered a little and managed to activate his devil fruit powers. His head disintegrated, shortly followed by the rest of his body. "Where did you come from?" Crocodile growled in an echoic voice. He did not materialize, clearly betraying his fear. "Another world," Luffy hissed before jumping into the air and striking with a hockey-imbued fist. That section of Crocodile's body and his head solidified as the man coughed up blood. Luffy sent the wretch to the floor, where he stared as Luffy landed in front of him. The whole room shook as a shockwave passed though. Crocodile knew in that moment that he was a dead man. This small person was only toying with him, drawing out the battle only to satisfy the urge to destroy. Luffy pulled back his arm before throwing his upper half forward. The fist collided painfully with his chest, and he felt a handful of ribs crumble. A foot came as a follow-up and kicked him to the side into another wall. The pirate ran forward and swung a right hook into Crocodile's jaw. He heard a snap, and blood sprayed against the wall where the croc's face collided with it. Luffy wasn't hitting as hard as he knew he could. He wanted him to stay conscious. Livid eyes offset the stony expression that the boy wore. Obviously Crocodile had done something to piss him off. The former Shichibukai contemplated this as he was sent tumbling across the floor, leaving a bloody trail in his wake. Footsteps accompanied Crocodile's labored breathing. The nearly dead man looked up to see the man looming over him, preparing for another blow. With much effort, and a little bit of blood, he managed to cough. "What have I done to you?" Luffy's eyes widened and then narrowed. "You killed Vivi, her family, her people and Robin. I'll never forgive you. You said, you're from another world. The other me wasn't here for them. So instead I'll give the Robin and Vivi of this world the revenge they deserve." "Why? Are you fighting for them, in this world though?" "Because, even if it's another world, they're still my nakama," Luffy roared and let the punch fly. A crater opened up around them. Before Crocodile lost consciousness, he managed to spit out, "Who the hell do you think you are?" Luffy brought both of his hands together right above Crocodile's head. His eyes were icy cold now. "I am," he began before snarling at his victim, "the Pirate King." The boy stopped just short of shattering Crocodile's skull, and the ex-Shichibukai knew no more. Stainless felt chills consume his body periodically. His fore he tried to sit up. Groans drifted up from his party as the others began to wake. The first thing he noticed was that he was surrounded by people who were either out like a light or barely lucid. Yamakaji seemed to be in a similar state as him. As vice admirals, stronger than the average Samaritan, they were among the first to awake. None of the Baroque Works agents or backup was conscious, having felt the brunt of the impact. All were sprawled out in front of rain dinners, some foaming at the mouth. The wave of hockey had knocked all of them out in less than a second. Just how powerful is he thought in dismay. That's when he looked over at the casino to see it in absolute ruins. He gaped at the figure standing on top of the pile. Luffy jumped down from his work, dragging a bloody pulp of a human being, which he hardly recognized as Crocodile, and looking like he hadn't even broken a sweat from his destructive activities. Luffy dropped the hardly alive ex-Shichibukai at Stainless' feet. The boy crossed his arms over his chest and practically dared the Vice Admiral to object to what he had done. Stainless swallowed thickly and wisely said nothing. Stainless gave a low groan, wiping the sweat off his brow. His sleeves were rolled up his arms and his honorary coat stored within his luggage. The hot sun was beating down on them without mercy. Mother Nature was not feeling kind. They were on their way to Aramalu to meet up with the ship that was to take them back to Marineford. The locals of Rainbase had offered to take them all back via sand ship, which the Marines happily agreed to. None of them were very keen on traveling camelback. After freeing the oppressed people, they were honored as heroes. They were all still trying to rouse themselves from Luffy's hockey, but were otherwise just peachy. The Marines quickly rounded up the remnants of Baroque Works. Everyone marveled over the mass destruction Luffy caused, and they were forced to call a doctor so that Crocodile didn't die before he reached Impelled Down. Speaking of Luffy, the young man was currently seated on one of the other sand ships, sleeping. Stainless was rather perturbed by the recent turn of events. All the fears he'd been subconsciously feeling were now brought to the surface. They had been proved. This man was dangerous, and he was infinitely glad that he was on their side. Although, having said that, Stainless was beginning to doubt that. The boy only seemed to be going with the flow, humoring them while they worked on a way to get him home. He even wanted something in return for helping them. Stainless was beginning to wonder if Luffy was actually a marine. A gust of wind carrying sand took his mind off more morbid thoughts, and he turned his attention to shielding his face. Yamakaji and Stainless swallowed in unison. Both were nervously watching the innocent mollusk stationed on the desk. Its eyes were still closed in sleep, but they knew it wouldn't be for long. They were expecting a call. Belu belu belu, belu belu belu, belu belu belu. The snail suddenly animated, opening its beady eyes to stare up at the two vice admirals as though to say, "Pick up already." Muttering something incomprehensible, Stainless reached over and picked up the microphone attachment. "Kacha. Vice Admiral, please deliver your report," the snail said in Admiral Akainu's voice, and both of them began to sweat profusely. "Why yes, sir, we're leaving the country now, sir. Crocodile is in custody." "So Monkey D. Luffy actually succeeded in defeating him?" "Yes, sir. Tell me exactly what happened, in as much detail as you can." Stainless winced before beginning to speak. "I'm sorry, sir, but there isn't much I can tell. We arrived at Crocodile's hideout, and just before we began to fight with Baroque Works, he asked for clarification on whether or not we wanted Crocodile alive. After I gave him an answer, he knocked all of us unconscious." "How?" "He used Haoshoku Haki, sir. We didn't even stand a chance," he admitted. There hadn't even been any resistance in him against that raw power and dominance. It was nothing like he'd experienced before. "I see, continue." "When we awoke, Crocodile's base was rubble and Crocodile himself wasn't in much better condition." "What about the boy? He wasn't even tired, sir." There was a moment of silence, which Stainless assumed was a thoughtful reflection on the new information. "Thank you for the report. You may return to your duties." The reply was short and formal. The snail fell asleep once more. Luffy was forced, and not without much whining on his part, into the meeting which was, ironically enough, about him, again. This time it was only he, Sengoku and his three admirals. He allowed himself to be brought into the war room by the back of his shirt like some sort of dog, pouting the entire while and dragging his feet when he could. He was surprisingly light for being so strong, so Aokiji had no problems whatsoever carrying him all the way through headquarters from his sort of party. They just broke out the sake too. The Pirate King was deposited just inside the door, and he decided that a place on top of the table would be a nice spot for his snack. The other two admirals watched with one eye open as he sat Indian style on top of their nice clean conference table and began gobbling up hunks of greasy meat, which he'd brought with him. Luffy watched them in return. He closely monitored all three admirals and their body language. He didn't trust them, and that bastard Akainu made his hackles rise. He was trying to remain calm, but the mere mention of his name made his vision go red. That motherfucker was one of the very few people he would never forgive. But this was one of those few occasions that patience and manners were necessary. He was relying on the Marines to get him home, which annoyed him, but he had no control over. Surely if he presented himself as their enemy they would throw their lives at keeping him down, and the longer he was here the longer he was away from his nakama. God knew how much he missed them. Luffy was aware of Sengoku's presence long before he arrived. The fleet admiral entered the room with a scowl on his face. He swept past them and assumed his seat, reclining with a sigh and pinching the bridge of his nose. "Monkey D. Luffy. I have to thank you for cleaning up that mess in Alabasta for us." Luffy grimaced. It wasn't the first time that he'd cleaned up their mess, so I have no problem formally asking you for assistance. Luffy continued to eat, but slower this time. He kept eye contact with Sengoku. The fleet admiral began to explain their predicament. "We are currently in the midst of a war between four factions. The Marines, Blackbeard and Big Mom, the Revolutionary Army and an alliance between Whitebeard and Red Hair. Blackbeard? He's currently our main priority. After he took down one of the supernovas and betrayed us, we've been looking for a way to stop him. However, all our attempts have failed." The Pirate King snorted. "You can't fight him the normal way. His devil fruit powers neutralize other devil fruit powers on top of having his own." All four Marines looked quite taken aback. He watched them out of the corner of his eye as he shoved several pounds of spare meat down his throat. Kizaru gave a short laugh. "Well, that explains why even one of us had trouble with him. Aokiji nodded in agreement. Luffy didn't mind Aokiji as much as the others. The Iceman had even lent him a hand in certain situations. He also saved Robin as a child and let them escape on several occasions. Even if he was once frozen solid, right now Luffy could tell that the Admiral was trying to read him, trying to find some sort of sign that the Rubberman would betray them. Well, Luffy wasn't exactly the betraying type. He was very straightforward. If the Marines held up their end of the deal, he had no problem helping them out, as long as they didn't ask him to fight people who he liked in his own world. But there was also another thing bothering him. That blonde girl, Rice or something like that, and her friend that looked like a mouse often talked about the other him, who was a Marine. They obviously knew him. What bothered him was that he hadn't encountered his other self at all yet. What I want to know is what exactly you did to that Shichibukai. You hid that battle. Akainu's dog-like growl shook Luffy out of his inner musings. The Pirate King looked over at the Admiral, trying not to spit fire and attack him. No one else spoke while Luffy and Akainu had their own little stare down. If anyone else had been awake, they would have fought each other, Luffy said, giving one of the reasons he'd knocked everyone out at Rainbase. Listen, you stupid brat, I don't care who the hell you are, but I don't like your attitude. Akainu had unwittingly crossed a line drawn in Luffy's mind. Any sign of aggression would be punished accordingly. The way the Admiral spoke began to make the pirate feel sick. He even stopped eating, but even the red-hot glare he sent wouldn't shut the man up. Luffy hopped off the table and sent a fist straight into the man's incessant gob. He made sure not to hit hard enough to knock him unconscious. Luffy stalked over to the lava man, who was trying to sit up with his back to the wall. 3 pairs of eyes drilled into his back. He grabbed Akainu by the throat, squeezing his windpipe with a little more force than necessary. The man would definitely have bruising later. Listen, I'll only say it once, Luffy rumbled in a threateningly low voice. I am so close to ripping your guts out and feeding them to you. One wrong move and I'll take pleasure in killing you slowly and painfully, understand? Akainu, despite not knowing how he got in Luffy's bad graces, nodded, grabbing at the hand closed around his neck. Absolutely disgusted by the wretch, Luffy threw Akainu to the side. The heavy body of the Admiral crashed through the wall. He made his way to the door, grabbing his hat and securing it back on his head. I'll help you, but keep that bitch away from me, or I will go through with my threat, he said to Sengoku. The tone of his voice left no room for arguments. Garp scowled over a new edition of the newspaper. Alabasta restored, ex-Shichibukai said to impel down. When the hell did this happen? By the date printed on it, this was a fairly recent event. The inside story was mostly based on rumors and speculation, but the key point was that the Marines were responsible for the shift in power. He scowled. Such a plan would never be hidden from him unless there was something else behind it, something that he would have protested against. A cold feeling filled his gut. This wasn't going to end well. Ji-chan, what you reading? Luffy's obnoxious voice floated by his ear, and the Vice Admiral flinched. The boy had somehow climbed onto his chair and was now dangling over the back of it, trying to read over his grandfather's shoulder. Garp sighed and massaged one of his temples. The newspaper, the easiest way to satiate the boy down was to give quick, simple answers to his quick, simple questions. Anything interesting going on? Garp decided that his grandson didn't need to know about the crocodile incident and turned to another, more mundane everyday business page. No, go bother someone else. But they all kicked me out, the boy whined in a high-pitched voice that only seemed to serve the purpose of grating on his nerves. Get out, he yelled before grabbing Luffy by the shirt collar and throwing him towards the door. What are you doing all the way out here? Rika queried with a quiet voice. The young man looked over his shoulder, smiling softly at her. She climbed out onto the roof with him, careful not to slip and fall off the building. The water of the bay sparkled orange and yellow in the sunrise. People were just beginning to rise, so smoke spiraled up from several houses in the city below. Ships were beginning to move, the harbor bells ringing in the morning air. You didn't stay here the entire night, did you? Luffy shook his head. No, Rika frowned again. His eyes were distant. Instead of looking at ease when he gazed at the peaceful setting, he seemed more conflicted. She didn't like that. What are you thinking about? My brother, he replied simply. I didn't know you had a brother, she blinked in surprise. We're not brothers by blood, but he's my brother all the same. That made far more sense. Where did you grow up? She asked, settling down next to him on the tiles. East Blue. They returned to silence. Rika let out a sigh as the wind ruffled their hair, her hands clasped in her lap. There was something that had been bothering her lately, something she needed to ask him, but her tongue felt heavy. He turned his face towards her, as though he sensed her inner struggle, and she couldn't refuse that face. One she knew so well, but didn't know at all. Are you a Marine? She whispered hesitantly. He was quiet for a moment. No, he looked back at the bay. I figured as much, she sighed, brushing blonde strands out of her eyes. What are you then? He looked at her once again, a strange look in his eyes. Are you sure you want to know? Yes. You can't let anyone else know, he said firmly. He made her promise not to tell. She promised. I'm a pirate. You have got to be shitting me. Rika reeled, and nearly fell right off the roof. Somehow the title, pirate, both fit him and didn't at the same time. She chalked it up to the double standards that now applied to Luffy. No way, her body beginning to tremble. Luffy pouted like a child. You don't have to be scared. Swallowing, Rika pulled herself together. Why the hell are you a pirate? He gave her a half grin. When I was 7 years old, a pirate saved my life and gave me this hat. Her eyes flicked up to the worn-looking straw hat perched on his head. I promised him that I would meet him again someday to return it as a strong pirate. The words came naturally from his mouth, and Rika had no trouble believing them. She counted to 5 and decided that she needed to stop looking for similarities between the two Luffys and treat them like two separate people. She didn't know this man. Did you meet him again? She asked. Luffy nodded, smiling brightly. The dreadful atmosphere was finally beginning to lift. Shanks gave it back to me though, said I deserved it. Shanks? He can't possibly mean. Do you mean Akagami Shanks? Rika raised her eyebrows. Luffy nodded. Well shit, this man had connections. If you're a pirate, then why are you helping us? He frowned at her before smiling once again. They're going to give me lots of money to bring back, and you're also my only way home. That's when Rika realized. They'd taken him from his nakama. He was a pirate, and apparently the strongest man in the world. His crew would be pissed. She resolved to help Vegapunk find a way for him to get him back and or send a message to his friends that he was just fine. Tell me about your crew, Rika said. She inferred that he was the captain. Luffy began to describe the different people he traveled with. A directionally impaired swordsman, a money-loving navigator, a lying sharpshooter, a womanizer cook, a reindeer doctor, an archaeologist, assassin, a cyborg shipwright and a perverted afro-skeleton. Rika was amazed. She laughed along with the pirate, finally feeling at ease around him, and he wasn't such a bad person for a pirate either. Maybe the world wasn't as cut and dry as she'd made it out to be after all. Maybe there was hope for them too. Vegapunk fidgeted nervously under his superior's gaze. Sengoku watched the elder man like a hawk, eyes never wavering or shifting from the panicking man. The silence was thick and stifling, both only waiting for the inevitable pin drop to break the awkwardness. You've been hiding something from us, Vegapunk, Sengoku slowly said, making sure that Vegapunk comprehended the pressure he put behind the words. He, being the mad and ingenious scientist that he was, completely understood and nodded after a short pause. Ah, I have, Vegapunk said, giving a loud sigh before he flopped down, almost melodramatically, in a chair in front of the desk. He had been caught red-handed, so he might as well spill the beans. It was me who stole all the light fixtures from. Damn it, this isn't about that, Sengoku shouted, a dangerous tick mark appearing on his forehead. Vegapunk laughed. Joking aside, he knew perfectly well that now was the time to explain. There wasn't really a need to keep secrets from the fleet admiral, after all. Alright, I'll be serious. Tell me what you know about Monkey D. Luffy, Sengoku said, reminding himself of who he was talking to. Well, first of all, Vegapunk began, I should explain that I don't know the whole of it myself. I contacted myself from numerous worlds until I got lucky. I explained the situation and he suggested Luffy. Sengoku raised his eyebrows. Really? It was that simple? Oh, no, it's a mite more complicated. Their world is in an era of peace, but most people don't really recognize that it's peaceful. Monkey D. Luffy, the undisputed strongest man in their world, is no hero. I'm afraid I don't understand, Sengoku frowned, thinking over the possibilities. Those words struck a chord of uneasiness deep inside him, and the reports and demonstration of the boy's power, even if only a fraction, were enough to draw concern. He's dangerous, Sengoku. Risk follows him constantly, wherever he goes. He's saved thousands of lives, but he's ruined just as many. Can you comprehend that, Sengoku? No one has experienced anything like it since Roger still sailed the seas. A sparkle of excitement and imagination twinkled in the elder's eyes. So he's not a marine? No, not by a long shot. Vegapunk chuckled and shook his head. That's what separates our two worlds. The occupation of Monkey D. Luffy. He's a catalyst, that one. My other self told me that he's unpredictable, so we have to be careful. Right now he's under the impression that we are his only way home to his nakama, who have let us borrow him by the way, and this puts us in a position of leverage. However, it's a dangerously precarious position, and if we were to make one wrong move he could and would annihilate us. Why does he think that we're the only option? Sengoku asked. Vegapunk grimaced. Well, I sort of outright lied to his face. His nakama know he's here, but he doesn't know that they know. We can also send him back anytime. Idiot, if he's really as powerful as you say, why on earth didn't you tell him? He'll try not to cause as much of a ruckus, which is good for us. He's notorious for stirring up trouble. Sengoku massaged his temples, feeling an oncoming migraine. The situation had just become a lot more complicated. Rika fumbled with a tall stack of papers and folders, on her way to deliver them to her superior. Her glasses were askew and her nose itched terribly, but she couldn't put down the mountain of paperwork. Recent events had spurred a movement in headquarters, and everyone was feeling the strain. Her thoughts were turbulent and chaotic. Questions droned on like bees, battering her repeatedly and not helping her in the slightest. For every question answered, two more would take its place. She was so lost in her thoughts that when she rounded the corner she bumped into someone, sending all her pages to the floor. Sorry, she squeaked, not even bothering to check who it was. Immediately her focus was on the things scattered across the floor. Irritation tickled at the edges of her mind. She was very tired. Watch where you're going next time, a deep voice barked in annoyance. Rika glanced upwards and spluttered in surprise. It was none other than Admiral Akainu. She jumped to her feet, giving a quick salute. Yes, sir. Before she could return to collecting her things, Akainu grabbed her by the arm and looked into her eyes. You're friends with that Luffy brat, right? Well, I guess it was true she was friends with their Luffy, but the other one she wasn't so sure. At that point she had no idea which one he was talking about. What do you know, girl? You have got to know something about that bastard. There isn't something right about him. A wave of panic overcame Rika, and though she tried to hide it her expression was painfully obvious. The grip on her arm tightened, and his thick fingers heated up. Fear accompanied the panic as he shook her small form savagely. Tell me what you know. He was definitely talking about the other Luffy. The burden of knowing that Luffy was a pirate suddenly became very heavy as she looked up into the Admiral's face. He was an idealistic juggernaut that cruelly enforced his viewpoint. To him all pirates were S, and those S had to be killed. Though she didn't know him that well, and even though he was a pirate, she couldn't bear to see him dead. Tell me, he shouted, and tears sprung to her eyes. She wrenched her bruised arm out of his grip and ran, not caring about the lost paperwork any longer. She would tell no one of what had just occurred. Ow. Hold still, damn it. Rika fumed as Luffy pouted childishly. After the incident concerning Crocodile, Luffy had sort of unofficially become a part of their military in some people's eyes. So of course he had been sent for a general physical and checkup. Rika was drawing blood, and the boy simply refused to cooperate. You stick it in too hard. Luffy stuck out his tongue at the young doctor, who growled in return. Shut up, she replied, feeling a vague sense of déjà vu. Sometimes he was too much like the Luffy that she knew. It made her inexplicably sad. This man, this pirate, was so strong, had gone through so much pain and agony, was hated simply for being born, and yet his life was filled with joy. The way he spoke told volumes. He loved being alive. He loved being a pirate. Their Luffy had only spoken once of being a pirate. Only once, and it surprised both Rika and Toma, the only two witnesses. It was just a childhood dream, he said, when he thought the world was just peachy and such adventure was real. Rika hated that conversation. The way that he spoke that time was nothing like the boy she knew. He sounded regretful, as though he still longed for that childhood fantasy. And here he was, from a different world, with different abilities and friends, living his dream. She hoped that the two wouldn't meet. The end result would be disastrous. Rika huffed, "Hold out your arm, I still can't find a vein." "No, I don't wanna. For the love of God, don't make this harder than it should be," she shouted. He laughed it off, but finally complied. She grabbed his arm and searched for the telltale blue mark. When she couldn't find one on the inside of his elbow, she turned to his hand and examined the back of it. His knuckles had thick calluses. With a small smile, she finally found a vein and carefully inserted the sterile needle. Luffy wrinkled his nose at the smell of the antibacterial wipes, but otherwise didn't complain. "There, that wasn't so hard, was it?" Rika said as she carefully labeled the sample before placing it in the tray. "By the way, why does your skin feel rubbery?" The pirate laughed, surprising her. He continued to grin as he answered, "I ate a devil fruit when I was little. The Gomu Gomu no mi. I'm a rubber man." That certainly explained a lot. "You're made of rubber?" Rika asked. "Yeah." Luffy hooked his finger on the corner of his mouth and pulled. The skin stretched, extending farther than should be possible, when snapped back into place. "Whoa," Rika grinned. She hadn't yet had the chance to examine a devil fruit user's ability up close before. "How far can you stretch?" "Why don't I show you?" He chuckled. "Just go up to the roof tonight." "Alright." Her eyes sparkled, and she could feel the stirrings of an adventurous spirit from deep within her. This man's optimism was contagious. Rika sneezed when she opened the door up to roof. It was a crisply chill night and the moon was bright and plump, illuminating the city below in a silvery wash. He was already there, wearing a sweater temporarily borrowed. His straw hat waved in the wind from its place on his back, hanging from his neck by a string. When she stepped out onto the roof, he immediately turned his head to look at her. He slowly stood up, careful not to fall off, and approached her. "You ready?" Rika nodded, undeniably curious. She wouldn't admit it, but she was very excited to see more of his abilities. "Yeah." With a she, he turned around, scanning the city with a smile. "Climb onto my back and hold tight." A frown marked her confusion, but she did it nevertheless. He made sure that her grip was strong enough before he singled out a single spot further down. He sent his arm stretching into the distance, where it latched onto a flag pole. Realization and horror dawned on Rika, but it was far too late. With a scream on her part, both of them were launched at breakneck speeds. She was sure she was strangling him, especially since he was trying to loosen her death grip on his neck. That had probably been the most reckless and stupid thing she had ever been a part of. "Are you an idiot? We could have died?" He laughed and made sure that she wasn't about to suffocate him before launching them off in another random direction in similar fashion. Very soon Rika found herself enjoying the exhilarating rush that it brought, even if she was sure she was going to have a heart attack. The wind whipped across her face and through her hair, the cold stinging her skin. She could feel her heart beat against her ribs. It was the most amazing experience she'd ever had. When they returned to the roof, she punched him in the face for endangering their lives, but as she walked back inside, followed by his laughter, she couldn't help but smile. Garp let out a deep breath, watching the morning fog clear as they approached Marineford. The sea was a murky green, the sky mostly clear. Fishing boats dotted the coastline, a few of which he waved to on their way in. A loud explosion alerted Garp of his grandson's arrival long before he actually showed, running from a couple of angry cooks. As soon as the boy had lost those on his tail, he went to his grandfather. There were dark circles under Garp's eyes, showing that he hadn't had much sleep on the voyage. Luffy was incredibly restless during the whole thing, excitement coursing through his little body from the prospect of a grand and important mission that had been described to him from others. And because he was restless, he made everyone else tired and cranky. They had found nothing, just as expected. "I can't wait to tell Rika and Toma about what we saw," Luffy said, excitement still evident in his tone. He leaned over the railing, silently willing Marineford to come into view, to emerge from the fog and announce the end of their seemingly endless mission. Slowly but surely the fog completely cleared and they could see headquarters in all its glory. The massive stone structure was still awe-inspiring. Garp found himself smiling as they made their way into the harbor. There were people waiting for them on the shore. They docked rather quickly, and Garp and Luffy were the first ones off the boat. As much as he loved the sea, Garp couldn't help but feel grateful that he was back on dry land. He slowly breathed in the salty air and watched the sun hit the sparkling white stone. Vice Admiral Garp. Garp turned his head to look at who was calling out to him. It was his colleague, Vice Admiral Stainless. "Welcome back." They clasped arms and laughed good-naturedly in a display of camaraderie. "I hope you guys didn't do anything too rash in my absence. I read about Crocodile." Stainless looked perturbed suddenly, the exact opposite of what Garp had been expecting, actually, about that. "You didn't do anything stupid, right?" The frown made its way into Garp's voice. The nagging feeling in the back of his mind was suddenly brought to the forefront as he examined his fellow Vice Admiral, who was looking a little sheepish. "Vegapunk found a solution to our problem with the war." "Oh shit, this can't be good. What's going on?" Garp demanded. "Vegapunk pulled someone from an alternate reality into ours. We didn't think it was possible, but it's true. He made a deal with Sengoku, but we wanted to be sure it was legitimate, so we sent him off to capture Crocodile." "Are you saying he defeated the Shichibukai?" Garp trusted Stainless, and if he said someone had come from another world he would believe it, no matter how unbelievable the claim was. "Yeah, I was there." The man shook his head. "It was scary, honestly. Vegapunk told us that he's the strongest man in his world, but it is one thing to hear about it and another to experience it. The kid knocked all of us out with hockey and then beat Crocodile within an inch of his life." "That was impressive. Did you say he was a kid?" Garp asked. "Yeah, you see, that's the thing. You're not going to believe who it is." "Tell me, it's your grandson." Luffy pushed through the crowd, searching for his two best friends. A wide smile spread across his face when he caught sight of Toma, who was also searching the crowd for his longtime friend. "Toma!" Luffy called, running towards him. The smaller boy looked over at the approaching Marine, but he didn't jump for joy or even smile. Instead he looked worried, even sick. "Luffy, how was your trip?" Toma asked, twitching nervously. "It was great. I even saw some whales, fantastic. Listen, Luffy, I have to tell you something. This is really important." The smile slid off of Luffy's face at Toma's tone of voice. He nodded, serious for once. He listened as Toma quickly explained the project, how Vegapunk pulled the strongest man through from another world and how that same man defeated Crocodile. "Sugoi," Luffy whispered under his breath, already indescribably excited. His whole body was trembling in anticipation now, longing to actually meet this incredible individual. A grin once again spread across his face, but this only seemed to make Toma worried. "Where is he?" "Luffy, that's the thing. Oi!" A voice called out, and the two of them turned to see Rika coming towards them. Luffy's heart stopped beating for a moment when he caught a glimpse of who was trailing after her. His breath caught in his throat, eyes widening in shock. He suddenly wanted to run, to hide, and to curl into a little ball and cry. All sounds faded as he watched himself walk towards them. It was him. It was him. "Toma," Luffy rasped in a hoarse voice. "What's wrong?" The other man turned his purple eyes towards him, expression worried. "That's him, Toma, from those dreams a couple months ago." He swallowed thickly. Toma's eyes widened when he realized what his friend was telling him. "He'll kill us all."